There are many bodies in bodies. Some are living and dancing and free. Most end up dead. But why? What causes the chain reaction of death after death after death? The quick succession of body after body after body reaching its morbid expiration. In this video, I will explain the mechanism which accounts for all of the bodies which end up bloody, battered, or worse. Beyond that, I will examine the film's broader commentary on Gen Z and the sometimes fatal consequences of the assumptions Gen Zers often make about others. Alice, played by Rachel Sennett, identifies a pattern emerging amongst the many deaths in bodies. She wrongfully assumes the pattern to stem from the group's initial game of bodies, which is a mafia-type party game. However, she accurately senses that some underlying system does govern the recent deaths in David's luxury mansion. By the end of the film, the true pattern and the characters' true colors are revealed. The true pattern of the killings does not center around who is or is not the quote killer for the initial party game as Alice first guesses. The true pattern centers around the different members of the group assuming the worst about each other and, as a result, causing themselves and each other to act their worst. David, played by Pete Davidson, is the first character to die. While the rest of the group is safe inside, David storms outside into the storm after a tense interaction with the rest of the group. David is not heard from for a little while, so his friends go and look for him. While alone in a room near the pool, B is frightened when David's limp and bloody body abruptly plasters itself against a window. The rest of the group soon scrambles outside to try and save David, but he dies despite their best efforts. Everyone is reeling from the death of their friend, but Jordan, the de facto leader of the group, finds David's bloody scimitar outside and brings it in. Everyone makes the same conclusion. David has been murdered. Someone used the scimitar to slit his throat. In other words, the group assumes the worst possible case for David's death. Not a single one of David's friends considers even for a second that David's death had been a freak accident rather than a full-blown murder. They disagree not about whether or not David has been murdered, but only about who murdered David. It is this very assumption that David was deliberately murdered rather than accidentally killed, which essentially causes all the other deaths that follow David's in the film. The group members do not make any overt accusations against each other, but suspicion lingers. Alice is the first one to pull the thread of friends killing friends. She floats the idea of their absent friend Max having come back to the house to kill David. Alice explains that Max may have killed David in a jealous rage due to David dating Emma. Max had professed his love to Emma the previous night, giving him some kind of motive for David's death. This theory doesn't make a lot of sense when you consider that Max has been longtime friends with almost the entire group. Alice does not pause and consider this fact. By assuming the worst about David's death and their longtime but absent friend Max, the present group members soon begin to suspect the worst about each other. As a result, they all begin to act as their own worst selves in what seem to be Generation Z versions of self-fulfilling prophecies. While Alice contemplates a longtime friend killing another longtime friend, Jordan makes her own suspicions known about Alice's older boyfriend Greg. The group arms themselves with knives and meat cleavers and go to find Greg. Even when he is surrounded by bloody and muddy girls with sharp blades in their hands, Greg assumes something of the best in his present company. At one point, he starts laughing and cracking up as he assumes that the group is messing with and playing some twisted prank on him. Greg does not believe that his accusers are serious in their threats. In fact, Greg is the only character over the course of the entire film to assume the best about the other characters. He actually exhibits this exact same tendency with David earlier in the movie when David clearly tries to make fun of and get a rise out of him. During this interaction, it takes Greg a second to realize that David is trying to insult him not because Greg is dumb or obtuse, but because he assumes the best about David even as David actively accosts him. Greg, a millennial, chooses to start every interaction from a place of sincerity and empathy. The younger Gen Z members of the group approach every action with suspicion, contempt, and thinly veiled prejudice. When the Gen Z members of the gang find Greg's go bag filled with survival supplies, including a hunting knife and a map with the location of David's house circled, the group, naturally, assumes that Greg is a murderer. As the group assumes the worst about Greg and his not unreasonable belongings, especially considering a storm is on its way, they soon come to assume the worst about Greg as well. All of their extreme assumptions about Greg come to a literal head when B cracks a kettlebell over his skull and kills him. In hindsight, part of me believes that Greg would not have hurt any of the girls present even if he had been given the opportunity. Greg was merely confused and was looking for some way out of a sticky situation. He was not given that chance. After Greg's death, Jordan and Emma tried to justify his death to themselves by saying that he was a, quote, vet who served in Iraq or Afghanistan. Alice then informs her friends that he was not a veteran, but a veterinarian. Jordan and Emma clearly assumed the worst about Greg from their perspective and allowed their incorrect assumptions to influence their behaviors. In their shared view, it was much easier to make the quick association between veteran and violence and Greg rather than veterinarian and caring and Greg. They assumed the worst about Greg as the alleged murderer. They assumed the worst about Greg by assuming the worst about his belongings. And they assumed, again, from their perspective, the worst about Greg and his occupation when all they knew for sure was that he was a, quote, vet of some kind. They convinced themselves that Greg was the worst, but as became quite clear in the movie, they were the only murderers as a group up to this point. Emma dies soon after Greg. Her death is not caused by an assumption of the worst about her as a person in the same way that Greg's death was directly caused by the group's inaccurate assumptions about him. However, the group still assumes that Emma's death was a murder rather than an accident. In other words, they assume the worst case scenario about Emma's death rather than an alternative. As the remaining group members assume the worst about the cause of Emma's death, this allows them to continue eyeing each other with their trademark mix of suspicion, derision, and hypocrisy. At this point in the movie, accusations of murder and anything else fly with abandon. The remaining members even circle back to accusing each other of David's murder despite several of them having known him and each other since childhood. All bets are off. The remaining members are convinced that one of them is a serial killer. As Sophie, Jordan, Alice, and Bea assume the worst about each other, they begin to act in ways which live up to the worst assumptions of their alleged friends. Jordan even goes so far as to threaten her friends with a gun. Alice had assumed, or at least guessed, that Jordan had killed David, and Jordan responds in kind. Despite Jordan's protests, Alice persists in her accusations, causing Jordan to somewhat live up to Alice's accusations and assumptions and shoot her in the leg in response. Then, after a scramble for the fired gun, Jordan is implied to shoot Alice. Though an accident, Jordan essentially lives up to Alice's mischaracterization of her. Before Jordan had purposely shot Alice in the leg, and before Jordan had mistakenly killed Alice, all of Alice's accusations would have been just that: accusations, assumptions. But by firing a gun at Alice not once, but twice, Jordan lives up to the worst assumptions about her and her character. The message of Bodies, Bodies, Bodies stands. By assuming the worst about others, we open ourselves up to justifying our own worst behaviors. The slanderous accusations against Greg as a murderous combat veteran allowed his attackers to justify their attack, even if only to themselves. On the flip side, when we assume the worst about others, we almost push them into fulfilling or living up to our own worst assumptions. Jordan is not an inherently violent person. Jordan is not an inherently bad person. Jordan becomes a murderer only after Alice accuses her of being one and instigates her into violence. There is one final layer to such talk about worst assumptions. If you, as an audience member, assumed all along that there was a serial killer in the midst of these characters, or even that they all took turns purposely killing different victims, you are subject to the same patterns of thought as these characters. You, like me, assumed the worst case scenario without even having the knowledge to justify it. You assumed the worst about some character, or perhaps switched between assuming the worst about different characters as you tried to pinpoint the murderer or murderers. There is nothing wrong with being cautious or suspicious. However, when we allow our worst assumptions about others to dictate our treatment of them, we should keep in mind that the consequences could be fatal both for ourselves and for anyone we make assumptions about. But then again, that's an assumption in itself. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more videos, and I'll catch you in the next one.